dig down into these things, you can write backstory for your character, you can do everything. Not everything you do here is going to get on the page. Okay? This is a bit where the showing and telling comes in, is once you know this about your characters, you've got to be careful not just to tell the reader, you need to show the reader. So, what does the character want? And you can express this differently. I always like to find a way to say, okay, the character expresses that they want to win the race. But really, they need to win the race because, what have I got here? They get approval, they gain approval. Everybody thinks they're great because they win the race. Right? So when you express your goal, it can start out with that just, I want to win the race level. And then as you start digging in, you'll understand the real need that they're trying to fulfill in the race. And why do they want it? Well, it comes down to winning the race. Did they always get picked last for the team? Did they always kind of start out really well in the race and then stumble halfway through? Do they not believe that they deserve to win the race? And then the conflict is why they can't have it. Are they too lazy to train? Are they frail and they just don't have the physical stamina to win the race? But the story is about how they get to that finish line or not. So the story can actually be about winning the race, or the story can be about learning how to gain acceptance from within yourself and not needing to win the race. So these are the things before you start writing your first draft for plotters, and when you get into revision for pantsers, is like, why is this really happening? What does this person really want? So in a lot of stories, the protagonist doesn't seem to get what they started out to get. But in the end, they got what they needed to get.
Okay. Wouldn't the Lord of the Rings be a good example?
It's a very complex story, so anything we talk about here is going to simplify everything. Who is the protagonist of Lord of the Rings?
Well, it's the, what's his name? Baron?
Frodo?
No?
Okay, so let me ask you a question. At the end of Lord of the Rings, who actually takes the ring into Mordor, into the fire? Frodo can't do it.
No, it's the...
Frodo is standing there, convincing himself that he can use the ring and not be turned. Gollum runs up and grabs him, and he lets Gollum fall into the fire with the ring. So he can't throw the ring in there. So there's an argument to be made that Gollum is the protagonist of that story. The fact that we meet him kind of halfway through the story doesn't really help. But stories like that are so complex because internally they have other stories. So you've got a whole bunch of protagonists. Aragorn is the protagonist of his own story. Boromir, even though he dies, is the protagonist of his story. Right? It's like an interweaving of very complex stories.
Gollum being the protagonist in that sense because he has to go into the fire. He couldn't give it up either. He was fighting Frodo for it, and if he hadn't fallen, he would have been just the same as Frodo, actually worse because he's been at it longer. So he wouldn't technically be the protagonist either.
Is he the antagonist?
Not necessarily, because Sauron is technically the antagonist because he wants to kill everybody.
Yeah, this is why there are university courses on that, but because you can make a case for pretty much anything.
Wouldn't technically the Fellowship of the Rings be actually the protagonist in themselves, but they go through certain conflicts of their own, creating a separate story. So the main protagonist would be the Fellowship versus Sauron's group, so that's the antagonist. But then, because like you said, it's a complex story. So then, branching off, each person, some of them are a bit harder to, like Frodo and all of them are different.
A lot, what happens in that trilogy is, so, I don't know if you could hear, but it's like, the stories keep splitting up. And a lot of, with that trilogy is that they all go off on their own little stories. So you don't have one story to follow. you follow this story for a while, you follow this story for a while, you follow this story for a while. And so it's not really a good example to use in this kind of environment. So other stories really are much more simple or more surprising. Or, I love The Lord of the Rings. I wouldn't try and write something like that. But if you're going to write something like that, then you start looking at, as a plotter, you're going to start looking at each of those stories and how they weave together, but making sure that as you write those stories, that you have the characters you need, they have their strengths, their weaknesses, they have high stakes on not getting their goal, there's lots of conflict. You just basically write the stories together. Any other questions on this?
One more book, Ulysses, Joyce.
Go ahead.
I have nothing to say. I just quizzical as to how something of an antagonist, I mean, the protagonist has got to be Bloom. Who's an antagonist? And because he's just sort of muddling his way through his day.
So that's conflict. His ineptitude is his antagonist. He's his own antagonist.
So it's man versus self.
Yeah. So a lot of these things are much clearer in genre fiction. In
Yeah.
literary fiction is just a genre. But in literary fiction, it's often very internal, very character, and sometimes it's very hard to see the plot. There's always a plot. You get from one end to the other, something happens in between, that's the plot. But in literary fiction, like Ulysses, it's sometimes so internalized to the person, and there's so many flavors of conflict as you go through, then it's hard to draw that line.
I have a sub-question on your conflict. Would you include what they were settled for? Why can't they have it? What were they settled for?
Yep,
Would that be?
definitely the character profile. I've actually written little short microfiction backstories for people. Say, okay, so they tried to do this in the past, so what happened? And they don't get it. A lot of times, I will try to think about it in that circumstance of, they say they want one thing, but they need another, they're going to get what they need. So I have to really figure out how to tie those two things together, so it's surprising for the reader at the end that what they get is not what they started with.
They're still happy with what they've got.
It's because it's what they need. Anybody else before we move on? Backstory. Backstory is tricky, because you have to know the backstory of the character, right? You have to know why she refuses to fall in love with this guy, why the detective always gets drunk when he should be out investigating, why the athlete does criminal activities when he knows he is going to get caught and it's going to blow up. You have to know these stories. And if you're a real plotter, you will write little backstories for your characters so you know them. So when they come to that stress point in the story, you know what's going to happen. Oftentimes when people first start writing, and any of this stuff can go into your first draft because you can always take it out, is they will put the backstory in there. So prologues are infamous for just being backstory. Right? Prologues have a use, and a good one is worth it. But if it's just a backstory about the world, the character, or the situation, then it really needs to come out. Right? But when you're writing your first draft, don't ask yourself about that. If you have to write the backstory, so as a pantser, you're going to write that backstory as part of your first draft. And then you're going to take it out, or you're going to recraft it so it's showing, not telling. Right? But the more you write about your characters to get to know them, the more you will actually drive a good story. That you won't sit there looking at the page going, I wonder what this person's going to do now. You will paint them into corners because you know you'll get them out. And painting them into corners is what makes an interesting story. have to put a little bit of backstory in there. When you finish